Hello, 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 everyone. Welcome to the ComicBase Livestream. We have a banger of a show coming up today. I'm Pete Bickford. I'm your host for the next hour or so, and we're going to be discussing an absolutely shocking move that creator Bill Willingham has just done in the world of comics this past week. And it's be prepared for lots of squinty legal analysis, slight conjecture on copyrights, all sorts of fiddly things like that. If that sort of thing does appeal to you, well, then, man, are you in the right place? But if it isn't, I guess the short version is that Bill Willingham has just declared that his Eisner Award-winning series Fables, along with all the characters, is now public domain. Basically do what you want with it. But there's a lot of fine point on that. And so before you go out and start publishing your own stuff, might want to stick around for the rest of the show. But it is a hell of a move. But we'll be getting into the particulars of it in just a bit. And as I'm doing this thing, I knew the second I started the show that because we have some phone coverage issues over on the West Coast office, that immediately things would start ringing. So, you know what? Excuse me just a moment. All right, so a couple of announcements before we really get going on the whole thing. First of all, we are going to be updating a day late this week because, as I said, we have some staffing issues going on. Some folks were out on a well-deserved vacation after the launch of ComicBase 2024, and then I heard that now there's sickness going on, so they're a little late coming back to the office and getting stuff done. So hang with us if you would a little bit, and we'll help you out as probably just a day late this week on getting out the update. The other thing that will happen is we are now just under 2,000 covers short of the 1 million cover mark. Absolutely astonishing number for me. And thank you to everyone who's helped out. I mean, just our editors have been going crazy adding new stuff. All of you guys have been doing amazing jobs submitting things that we've never seen before, foreign series, crazy variants, you name it. It's just been pouring in, and we've been trying like crazy just to keep on top of everything. This is going to be a hell of an update, but and we will do something special. I hope we do something special when we hit the 1 million cover mark. I don't know what that'll be yet, but I'm pretty excited. All right, so let's get right into it. Let me switch over to the other screen here. I believe that's the one right here. And let me read a great deal of this straight from Bill Willingham's mouth himself. This is on his Substack, which is well worth reading, billwillingham.substack.com. He calls it These Foolish Games. And Fables press release of basically dated 15th of September, so a couple of days ago. From release, as of now, 15th September 2023, the comic book property called Fables, including all related Fables spin-offs and characters, is now in the public domain. What was once wholly owned by Bill Willingham is now owned by everyone. For all time, it's done, and as most experts will tell you, once done, it cannot be undone. Takebacks are neither contemplated nor possible. Why did you do this? A number of reasons I thought I'd cover over some time, and in no particular order they are. Number one, practicality. When I first signed up for my creator-owned publishing contract with DC Comics, the creator was run by honest men and women of integrity who, for the most part, interpreted the details of the agreement fairly and above board. When problems, let me go ahead and put myself in the stream here a little bit. When problems inevitably came up, we worked it out like reasonable men and women. Since then, over a span of 20 years or so, those people have left or been fired, to be replaced by a revolving door of strangers of no immeasurable integrity who now choose to interpret every facet of our contract in ways that only benefit DC Comics and its owner companies. At one time, the Fables properties were in good hands, and now, by virtue of attrition of employee replacement, the Fables properties have fallen into bad hands. I can't afford to sue DC to force them to live up to their letter and spirit of our long-time agreements, since even winning such a suit would take ridiculous amounts of money out of my pocket and years out of my life. I'm 67 years old and don't have the years to spare. I've decided to take a different approach and fight them in a different arena, inspired by the principles of asymmetric warfare. The one thing in our contract the DC lawyers can't contest or reinterpret to their own benefit is that I am the sole owner of the intellectual property. I can sell or give it away to whomever I want. I choose to give it away to everyone. I couldn't prevent Fables from falling into bad hands. At least this way I can arrange that it falls into as many good hands as possible. Since I truly believe there's still good people in the world, more good people in the world than bad ones, I count it as a form of victory. He then goes into some philosophical points about the copyright being overly long, which I'll get into in in due course. Certainly, I'll just say that yeah, he's definitely got a good point. But then getting down to the basics of what exactly has DC done to provoke this, and I'm just going to read what he says here. Too many things to list exhaustively, but here are some highlights. Throughout the years of my business relationship with DC, with Fables, and with other intellectual properties, DC has always been in violation of their agreements with me. Usually it's in small matters, like forgetting to seek my opinion on artists for new stories, or for covers, or formats of new collections and such. In those times, when called on, they automatically said, "Oh, sorry, we overlooked you again. It fell through the cracks." They used the "fell through the cracks" line so often and so reflexively that I eventually had to borrow them from using it ever again. They are often late reporting royalties and often underreport said royalties, forcing me to go after them to pay the rest of what's owed. Lately, our practices have grown beyond the mere annoyances, prompting some sort of showdown. First, they tried to strong arm the ownership of Fables from me. When Mark Doyle and Dan DiDio first approached me with the idea of bringing Fables back for the 20th anniversary, both gentlemen since fired from DC, during the contract negotiations for the new issues, the legal negotiators tried to make it a condition of the deal that the work to be done as work for hire, effectively throwing the property irrevocably into the hands of DC. When that didn't work, their excuse was, "Oh, sorry, we didn't read your contract going into these negotiations, so we thought we owned it." More recently, during talks to try to work out our many differences, DC officers admitted that their interpretation of our publishing agreement and the following media rights agreement is that they could do whatever they wanted with the property. They could change stories or characters any way they wanted. They had no obligation whatsoever to protect the integrity and values of the IP, either from themselves or from third parties. Telltale Games, for instance, want to radically alter the characters, settings, history, and premises of the story. I've seen the script they tried to hide from me for a couple of years, nor did they owe me any money for licensing the Fables rights to third parties, since such a license wasn't anticipated in our original publishing agreement. When they capitulated on some of the points in a later conference call, promising on the phone to pay me back monies owed for licensing Fables to Telltale Games, for example, in the execution of the new agreement, they reneged on their word and offered the promised amount instead as a, quote, consulting fee, which avoided the precedent of admitting that was money owed and included a non-disclosure agreement that would prevent me from saying anything but nice things about Telltale or the license, and so on. There's so much more, et cetera, but yeah, it's like, can't go on. And that's, there's some blah blah blah, but that is the soul of what he's saying on the whole thing. And go ahead and return to the main camera if I can make that come up. Yeah. Now, there's a clarifying statement issued by DC, and certainly a clarifying statement issued subsequently by Bill Willingham, the substance of which is that don't go thinking that this means that you can now go ahead and just grab the Fables trade paperbacks and write them off as your own and pass around copies and do anything like that. You can't. Those works they're locked down. They were provided for in the exclusivity of the publishing agreement. They are and remain contractually protected. I'll be careful in my usage on this one by DC, and DC for darn sure will go after you if you try to do such a thing. But where Bill Willingham seems to find himself is in a very strange situation where he doesn't seem to feel like he can profitably work with DC anymore. He cannot. He is bound up in an exclusive agreement with DC, which is still in force, that says, "Hey, any Fables, comic publishing has got to go through us." He can't make another deal with somebody else while that agreement is still in force, and they haven't voided that agreement, so he can't do anything new with Fables. But now, by declaring it public domain, it means anyone, which ironically includes DC, can now do anything they want with Fables. And as far as that goes, as far as writing new stories and such. Furthermore, and we're going to get into the difference between the copyright and the trademark aspect of all this, because the trademarks previously were held entirely by Bill Willingham, which I do not believe is in dispute by DC. I'm going to read their statement in a moment, but I do not believe they're actually disputing that in a substantive way. But if the trademarks were perfectly well owned by good grief, sorry guys, we are now going to be turning off the phone. You knew this would happen right in the middle of the show. Power off, go. All right, cool. All right, But because the trademarks, if they were owned entirely by Bill Willingham, then him declaring that he is releasing them into the public domain means that anyone can now work with those characters and do new things with them. And also further, it would seem to imply that you could make new lunchboxes or stickers or skateboards or whatever else with the likenesses and distinct traits of, Big B Wolf or whatever you want, and no one could say different. Now, as far as reusing specific pieces of art, that probably is still a copyright violation. But if you want to draw your own art using those characters, you'd probably be completely in the clear. Let me read DC's response to this one, because they weren't going to go down without a fight on this one. And also, when you read things like this from lawyers, it pays to read them 2 or 3 times over and see very specifically what they are saying that they are defending, and what they, by not saying, are more or less conceding to the argument, or at least would appear to be. DC's came back with as they put it, a rare corporate statement. Quote, the Fables comic books and graphic novels published by DC, and the storylines, characters, and elements therein are owned by DC and protected under the copyright laws of the United States and throughout the world in accordance with applicable law, and are not in the public domain. DC reserves all rights and will take such actions DC deems necessary to or appropriate to protect its intellectual property rights. So let's get into it a little bit in the weeds here and talk a bit about copyright and about trademark. But before we do that deep dive, let me, because I haven't taken the time beforehand, let me stop and say hi to folks, and also check in, make sure that nothing other than my phone is blowing up here. So Mike being first into the chat here. Good afternoon from Washington, Vancouver. Andre's joining us. Welcome. And Andre also, by the way, wants to let everyone know that the next edition of the cover catalog is coming out very shortly. Matter of fact, I think he's saying it's available online right now. The link for that should be in the forum notes on that one for the torrent, because this thing is massive. Rob Weinberg say hi. Zanzu Comics. Brian Price from Denton, Texas in here. It looks like things are getting hot all over the country right now. Our moderator Greg Hex, obviously in the house. Jet City Comics from the Pacific Northwest. Brian McClure from Novi, Michigan. And I think that's just the saying hello part of the whole thing. And people are saying, yeah, it's DC's legal department calling you. No doubt. No, actually, it's a maid that I've asked to do a nice cleaning on the place. I'm heading down to Florida in a little bit, because one of the downsides if you go away from a house for any length of time in Florida is you will come back and you'll find out their palmetto bugs will creep through somewhere and have just decided this is a good, nice, cool place to die, and will just laid their corpses out in the middle of your floor. It's not like it's crawling with them, but you walk into a nice place, you don't want to see a bug in the middle of your floor. So it's like, just for once, it'd be cool. So anyway, Florida guys, what are you going to do? All right. But let's go back and do a little bit of a dive, because a lot of the talk on the nets about this issue has to do with things like, hey man, Snow White and the Big Bad Wolf and things like that. I mean, that's, those are all story characters. I mean, they're hundreds of years old. I mean, how are they copyrightable in the first place? It's, I mean, it's like, so I mean, hey, who does he think he is, giving away things that were everyone owned already? And, as obviously you'll see, DC certainly thinks they own them. Bill certainly thinks he, until 5 days ago, owned them. But let's talk about why he actually does own them, despite the fact that the characters upon which they're based are hundreds and hundreds of years old. So to start with, let's get into a basic discussion, the difference between copyright and trademark. Now, all these things were actually written into very, very early American law. I believe there's even reference to it in the Constitution for copyright. But original copyright, basically what it does is it says, if you make something, you and you alone have the rights to control who is allowed to print it, who's allowed to make derivative works from it. You get to control how the profit comes from the labor of your own creation. Originally, this was a very, very short term. Back in the early 1800s, it was only 14 years, which you could renew once. Then they doubled that to 28 years. And then, starting, really in the 50s, it really got going. They started really extending the term of copyright. So, where it used to require you had to file it, register with, the, U.S. Patent and Trademarks Office. You had to put a copyright notice on things. If you failed to put a copyright notice on it, it was automatically not copyrighted. So, for instance, if you ever wonder why it is that Dawn of the Dead is such a popular movie at Halloween time, it's because I think it was called some like Night of the Flesh Eaters or something originally. And when they did some last minute reshoots on the thing before releasing it, they forgot to include the copyright notice on the film. So they released it out there, let it slide for a couple, 3 years. And by the time anyone noticed on the whole thing and made a deal about it, it had become public domain. So the idea about copyright fundamentally is meant to balance the idea of like, look, you earned this, you worked for it, it came out of the labors of your own mind and your own efforts, and you as a creative person should be allowed to to profit from that. People shouldn't just be able to steal your stuff. At the same time, there's a public interest in having a shared culture and being able to share the great things that everyone has contributed. So copyright doesn't last forever. And so that's why there's a term to it, and why certain formalities, especially originally, had to be observed to say, hey, is this, something you're giving up just originally, or you mean to hold on to it for a while? And even its most expansive term, in, I believe, 1998, the Sonny Bono Copyright Protection Act. Yes, that's Sonny Bono, as in Sonny Bono and Cher. He became I believe, a California senator. I'm sorry, congressman. I apologize. And he authored, something which extended the copyright even beyond. At that point, it was. Let me look at my notes on this one. Yeah, it was 20. It was, yeah. So it was 95 years, or the life of the author plus 70 years, whichever was less. And they extended it even further from that for a while. But it seems like at this point, with a divided Congress, there is no appetite for extending it further, at least in the very short term, which means, and it's not, I think, coincidental that the thing that is almost always about to slip into public domain, which keeps not slipping into the public domain through all these various rather extreme copyright extensions that have happened over the last 50 years or so, is Steamboat Willie, the first appearance of Mickey Mouse in an animated, sound synchronized feature. And so Disney, of course, mortally afraid that that the trademark and the copyright on Steamboat Willie goes away. It's not an absolutely existential threat for them, because very little of Disney's revenue in this day and age is based on the 1928 likeness of Mickey Mouse. But they hate seeing the beginning of the end of some of their most valued properties of slipping away. And miraculously, there has been legislation that's arrived just in time to keep that thing extending. Although, if nothing else changes, on January 1st, 2024, so this year, actually, as it turns into next year, Steamboat Willie will go into the public domain. Very specifically, Steamboat Willie. All right, so now let's use that as a bridge to get into the concept of trademark. Trademark is the idea that they're identifying marks about something that are tied into your business or your trade. That you've essentially made them unique. They're not just a generic form of the mark. They're not a generic form of whatever the thing is you're using, but you've made them unique to you and your business. And those things can keep going as long as you keep using them in business. Now, there's a couple interesting points about trademark law. One of them is you have to establish the uniqueness of it. So, for instance, it's very important if you make, paper tissues that can be used to wipe your nose if you have a cold, that you refer to them as Kleenex brand paper tissues. They're not a Kleenex, right? And the same for the same reason, if you have a dry copy process, which makes copies of one document into another copy of the whole thing, you call that a Xerox brand copy. You don't, or a copy using the Xerox process. You don't call it. You don't call just any copy a Xerox. And to the extent where both Kimberly-Clark and the Xerox Corporation have armies of people that have sent letters to any number of productions that dared refer to these things in film or television, newspapers, etc., use them as the generic, sending them essentially a form letter which says, hey guys, Kleenex is a registered trademark of the Kimberly-Clark Corporation. It is not the generic name for a facial tissue. It's the name of a specific facial tissue, and we can't allow you to use it in the generic, because if they allow their mark to become just the generic name of something, suddenly the trademark itself is in jeopardy. And so, it's funny because even these things that have really slipped into the language despite their best efforts, they're required to keep the defense of the uniqueness of it up. And that's another interesting thing about trademark. And it's one where, again, you got to realize that trademark law puts the companies themselves in kind of a rough situation on this one, because it makes them act the bully in sometimes in cases where I'm sure they would rather not. And that is, for instance, that trademarks have to be defended in order to be considered still not abandoned. There's no gold standard, that says, oh, well, if you're doing this when clearly you haven't abandoned your trademark. I mean, if there's any doubt, like, so if your thing hasn't appeared in commerce for a while, like let's say Kleenex comes up with, a new brand of facial, tissues called the Fabulizers, and they don't sell, Kleenex for a number of years. People could, in theory, make the argument, well, hey, Kleenex isn't a brand you're currently using right now. I haven't seen any new products with it. For that matter, haven't seen a new animated cartoon starring Mickey Mouse lately, or haven't seen any new, Xerox brand copiers. You seem like you're focusing on cameras or whatever else lately. If these things ever become even slightly dormant, you can make the argument they've been abandoned, unless every time you see someone infringing and starting to move in on your territory, you defend it. I mean, it's basically, you have to make, if it can be proved that you knew someone else was abusing your trademark, using without your consent, and you didn't sue them, if you didn't go on the record in the legal sense, essentially means suing them, at that point, then they can actually come back later and say, well, hey, man, you knew we were doing this and you didn't say anything about it, so clearly it's not the active trademark. At which point you have now surrendered your trademark to the scumbags who were using it. And this is actually why Disney gets put in the very unflattering position of when, like, a daycare center paints Mickey Mouse on the wall, they have to go to court and sue them and say, hey, man, you didn't do that under license. You didn't do it with our permission, and you abused our trademark, as like the logo for your daycare center, and so we can't have that. And so, yeah, even if we just collect $200 from you or $250, we have to sue you. It's the law. It's, again, it sucks. It makes them look the bully, but they have no choice. So I mean, it's interesting because you've got the trademark for as long as you can hold it. Yes, and there's a complicating factor on the Steamboat Willie thing, which we'll get into that one, because that's more mud that I think they're throwing at the game on their logo element. So on the trademark issue, going back to Bill's situation, so let's talk about the copyrights that apply, and let's talk about the trademarks that apply, because you can get in trouble with either one. Okay, all right. So let's say Bill Willingham writes Fables #1, which he sets out the land where the Fables live. Essentially a fictionalized sense of New York, where old-time fairy tale characters are remembered. They've lived on forever, as opposed to the Mundies, the mundane people. But they're always a little bit different than you remember them from the stories. But they live on in our current day. All right, so he sets the whole thing up. He starts the plot rolling and so forth. That thing gets encapsulated into a comic book that's however many pages, and then published. All right, that work, that particular script, that particular story, the art that came accompanied and so forth, that is a copyrighted work, right? So that there's a death date on that, right? 95 years, from the lifetime of the creator, or 70 years from what was it? 70 years from sorry, just once again referring to my notes, because again this stuff changed so much. Yes, it's 95 years, or the life of the author plus 70 years, whichever is shorter. And there's even a footnote to that one where if you stuck it in a drawer and you didn't publish it, then it could go as long as 120 years. But all right, that one doesn't apply on this one. But anyway, so the copyrighted work, Fables #1, it's definitely still copyrighted, right? Now, the question is, who owns the copyright to that one? And this is where our good friend the Indicia come in, right? And here I'm going to say DC, own a division of Warner Brothers, which itself is now a division of Comcast. They played, they're a bit of a jerk on this one. So if you're used to squinting at the tiny print on the whole thing, here's an issue of Fables number 33. And it'll become obvious why Fables number 23. I'll become obvious in a minute why I'm reading from Fables 23. Fables 23, March 2004, published monthly by DC Comics. No dispute there. Their address and address changes to blah, blah, blah. Fables is copyright 2004, Bill Willingham and DC Comics. Interesting. And DC Comics. Where's the and DC Comics part? All right, reserve. All characters featured in this issue, the distinctive likenesses thereof, and related elements are trademarked Bill Willingham. So the Vertigo logo is a trademark of DC Comics. The stories, are fictional, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But so in this initial one, they're like, okay, the thing I'm holding in my hand right now is copyright of Bill Willingham and DC Comics, and Bill owns all the trademarks. So that's seemed fairly clear at the time. You say, well, why does DC own any of the copyright in this thing? I mean, shouldn't Bill own the whole thing? Well, he said, well, let's, maybe not. I mean, did he pay for the cover? No, probably didn't. Probably DC commissioned that one. Okay. What about the ads inside? Well, DC probably, kind of owns the rights to republish those. On the, what about the house ads? What about the editorial from the publisher at the back? Things like that. All right, so DC's clearly got something that they actually own in this book that I'm holding in my hand. So, copyright of Bill Willingham and DC Comics seems fair. I'm going to be charitable in this one. So, I don't think they're up to any mischief at this point. So now let's look at the collection, Fables, book number 2. The copyright is ever so slightly different, although the circumstances of what it printed are not really different. Published by DC Comics, and cover, compilation, and characters, sketches, copyright 2003 DC Comics. So they're saying specifically that they own the cover. They said that they own the character sketches. All right, fine. They probably paid for those. They say they own the compilations. So any stuff in here which isn't just Bill's stuff, so the particular form of the whole thing, here's some sketches by Mark Buckingham, which DC undoubtedly paid the bill for, and so forth. So you're saying, okay, yeah, we own the compilation. Bill owns Fables. Copyright 2002, 2003, Bill Willingham and DC Comics. So again, fair enough. I don't see anything where they're really stepping over the line right now. Interestingly, so DC went back a number of years ago because Fables proved very, very popular, and they did a reprint of it. Under the essential, Vertigo Essentials. This is a reprint of Fables number 1, plus about 20 pages of DC hawking their stuff. If you hunt, and you have to hunt for the copyright on this one. Vertigo Essentials Fables number 1, January 2014, published by DC Comics. Okay, same old. Copyright 2013 DC Comics. What happened to Bill Willingham? Interesting. All rights reserved. Blah blah blah. Fables copyright Bill Willingham DC Comics, and now TM Bill Willingham, and then they name character after character after character. So just. But they're also saying Jack of Fables is TM Bill Willingham and DC Comics. TM Bill Willingham. Cinderella from Fabletown with Love is TM of Bill Willingham and DC Comics. TM Bill Willingham. Cinderella, Fables are Forever. TM Bill Willingham and DC Comics. TM Bill Willingham. So is the trademark basically the title of the name? Is that the part that they're claiming they own? I'd read that as kind of yeah. But you'll notice that the overall tone of all of this is that they are claiming to own progressively more of the stuff, and whenever they can fudge the whole thing and stay anywhere within the lines, they are constantly upping the game as far as how much they believe that they have their name on it. It kind of reminds me when I'm walking my dog in the morning. It's like if any of you guys who own a dog, you'll know that apparently the rule of all dogs is if you pee on it, it is yours. And DC seems to be marking their territory a lot as they go on. And the assertions of DC's dominance on this one are becoming more and more aggressive as they go on. Now, where it seems like everything just hit the fan, though, is and unfortunately, I don't have access to the original contracts with Bill Willingham and DC Comics, but nothing I've seen so far in the part that both sides have said causes me to believe that what I'm saying is in dispute. Is like I say, it's very interesting. Sometimes, like the way apparently the way that they tell where a stealth bomber is they look at the air and they look for the hole. So, but I mean, it's almost the way that it's like if you're looking for like Pluto with the early telescopes, you couldn't see it, but you could see the effect of Pluto on other things. You feel like you can see what everyone really thinks they own by what the other guy isn't contesting. And it seems for the most part that DC is not contesting that Bill owns the trademarks. They seem to think that they have copyright, in a sense at least, of the particular stories that got written, which is interesting because if I was writing a book for a book, I would have copyright of the book unless I assigned the copyright to someone else. I suspect what really happened, which, this theory at least is in keeping with the statements made by Bill Willingham, but again, only he and DC Comics could confirm this 100%, have reached out to Bill for, I think, very good reasons. He decided not to be part of the podcast, but I do wish him the best in all this. But I suspect what's really happening is that he has what's called an exclusive publishing deal with DC Comics, which is to say, there's language in their contract which almost undoubtedly says, yes, you, Bill Willingham, in consideration for the things that they are going to give him, the monies, royalties, whatever else, have an exclusive deal with us. In other words, you can't make the same deal with 17 other guys. It's not a non-exclusive deal. Would say, yeah, you're publishing some books with us, but you could make the same deal with Image tomorrow, and you could make the same deal with Marvel the day after. It's undoubtedly an exclusive comic publishing deal with DC Comics. I realized that time there were like Fables lunchboxes and things like that. Probably there was exclusive merchandising deal. So if he wanted to make his own lunchboxes and stuff like that with Fables characters, I want to say I saw a Fables skateboard at one point, which was undoubtedly licensed. That was also probably done as an exclusive merchandising deal. So unless one side or the other breaks the deal, so the deal on a contract is typically in return for X, we will perform Y. You can't have a contract without what's called consideration. So in other words, you can't just say, I will do X and you don't have to give me anything. That's not an enforceable contract. You have to give me something, even if it's just goodwill, but you have to state that it's always in consideration of. But in return for X amounts of money, he will get, he will be given, he gives DC the sole rights to publish his comics and probably merchandise the characters and things like that. And that does apply to him until the contract is either terminated by agreement of both parties, or one or both parties is contested and found in breach. At which point, as soon as the "if you do this, I'll do that" deal goes away, and the contract's no longer in force, and all hell usually breaks loose. But it breaks the contract. Interestingly, Bill Willingham has a interview I came up with earlier on where he said, look, Andrew Rev over at Comico hasn't been paying me. He's in violation of my publishing agreement on Elementals. And this is a couple of years ago, I therefore declare Elementals is now public domain. So he's been this path before. That's an interesting one, though, because I'm not sure where the ownership of the characters was, or whether he assigned rights to them at the time of the publishing deal. I'm murkier on this one. Unfortunately, I sold all my copies of Elemental, so I can't refer to the characters to say how the rights were treated in the whole thing. But if he is correct in the contention that one side of the contract broke their agreement, then it can be argued that it's called a material breach, and it's enough to require the termination of the contract itself. At which point he would be within his rights to put the Elementals into public domain. But on the other hand, I wouldn't be publishing any Elemental stuff myself unless I really had a lot more clarity on that situation. So I'm just saying, guys, if it were me, I wouldn't be touching that one. On Fables, on the other hand, it seems like so far, DC has not materially. They seem like they're claiming ownership of the particular stories, which is interesting. And honestly, I think what it really comes down to is they're potentially somewhat confusingly asserting that a contract exists between Bill Willingham and them to exclusively publish the comic stories in so in other words, he can't give them other people. They're putting this down almost in summary form as a copyright him and them, but they're commenting on it that says, "Hey, no, we have legal rights on this one, and we will enforce them." So again, I think it'd be a very poor idea if they were to if you were to go and try to reprint old Fable stories and just hand them out over the internet. I don't think DC would let you get away with it. Interestingly, there's a number of subsequent filings that DC put in after all those copyright notices they put in their book saying it's owned by DC and Bill Willingham, where I imagine Bill's lawyers basically demanded them, where they time and time again said, "Oh yeah, that part where we said, Bill Willingham, as a work for hire for us, was doing this stuff. Yeah, we didn't mean it. We're assigning the copyright of this work for hire stuff to him," which, by the way, in Bill Willingham's further commentary was apparently they tried the work for hire stuff several times later in the future, and it's absolutely crazy making. What work for hire means to a creator is like, let's say you do work for hire for ComicBase. Like I pay you guys to write me a story to use on the ComicBase entry for say the Elementals, right? So I contract Joe to say, look, I'll give you $20. You write me a 300-word blurb on the Elementals Volume 1. At which point we own all the rights. This is work for hire. I give you $20, and we can do whatever the hell we want with it because it's ours now. You transferred your rights to us. That's what work for hire essentially means. DC keeps on trying to insert the work for hire aspect of it, even in these filings that they put in, saying that, oh yeah, that part where it was he and DC Comics, we really meant it was trademark him. But right in the filing, they'll say, yes, the work for hire person giving the right away is DC Comics. I'm like, okay, clearly there was some legal tension going on about the years, but again and again, it was being reasserted that Bill was the owner. So I'm going to assume, unless someone wants to present me with evidence, using a different thing, that the Bill actually did own the trademarks on these ones. So at that point, can he give them away? Yeah, if he owns them, you can do what you want with the trademark. Which means essentially that if you want to write your own Fable stories using his characters, using Snow White as a as an office holder, and Bigby Wolf as like a gumshoe detective, and whatever those things are, that you can go ahead and do them. Backing up to a previous question, it's like, well, wait, did Bill own him? Maybe he didn't own him to start with, because we knew who the Snow White was beforehand, right? Snow White's the person who bit the apple, fell asleep, had the seven dwarves with her. The whole shtick, right? Well, you can see that the Snow White of that and the Snow White of Fables, yeah, they start from the same place, but they're clearly different characters at the end. His character could even say, yeah, I started out like that, but now I'm something different, which brings us to get back to full circle to Mickey Mouse. All right, so we said trademarks can, copyrights can go away, and trademarks can go away if the thing that was trademarked falls into the public domain. So let's go back to Steamboat Willie, and here's where you got to just admire Disney's legal department for being able to throw such amazing amounts of shade on what in a normal world would be a somewhat clear-cut case of like, dude, you had a 100-year run at this thing, give it up. But you might remember a couple of, number of years ago, every once in a while, DC, as part of like the opening credit sequence for a Disney movie or a Pixar movie, they would use the old Steamboat Willie, chuffing on the ferry boat, and then they wrap the thing around to the Disney logo, and then they put that right in the middle of the new movie's opening sequence. Were they doing that just out of, as I took it, love for their long and storied history of animation? Possibly, but I think the real genius of it is because Disney's lawyers apparently have gone on record to say, well, maybe Steamboat Willie's going to slip into the public domain this year, but you know what? That sequence was used in a modern property in kind of a new way. So you can't use any of that. That part is the copyright extension on that one starts with Monsters Incorporated or whatever the hell we use that. So that thing's going to stay our trademark, even though the thing that it is slipping into public domain. They're claiming the trademark will live on. I don't know. I think someone is looking at this one and saying, "Hey, I want to make a Steamboat Willie Lego set. I want to make a Steamboat Willie, whatever the hell, Halloween costume." And as long as you stick to the exact character design, without the gloves, without the little button-up thing that, red suit that you later on got, or else, if you stuck to straight Steamboat Willie, no alterations, someone is going to find it useful to push that matter all the way through the court and say, hey, come on, give it up. Steamboat Willie, the character design that was originally there, that was copyright in 1928, that thing is over. Because the one that came around in 1935 or so with the red suit, you can say, well, that one's got a few more years to run. So I wouldn't be showing modern Mickey Mouse for a while. But the Steamboat Willie one, I think if the only thing that's standing between that and copyright extinction on that one is the fact that they reused the sequence in a modern movie, I don't know how much I like Disney lawyers' chances on that one. Yes, will they beat whoever the latest Saul Goodman, gumshoe that works out of a storefront is in court on that one? Probably, but honestly, I don't like their chances. So someone who has enough money to push that one to the end is probably going to force Disney to give up that line of defense on Steamboat Willie. That would be my conjecture at this point. But I gotta say, it's a hell of a way to throw shade on the issue. So kudos to you. Disney's attorneys. So anyway, all right. So let me read some concepts out of this one here. Let's see here. Department of Comics with Agent of Camp saying it looks like DC owns the stories and William owns the concepts of the stories. It very much depends when he wrote it, whether he assigned them the rights. It's not typical to, and I'd be surprised if he did. I assume I'm going to say the much more typical arrangement when you have someone publish your stuff. Typically, the only time you assign the rights on something like that is if you're writing for like an intellectual journal, like a scientific journal, where you might not know, hey, I wrote this paper on blah blah blah, and I don't know if it's going to get recited, repurposed, put up on LexisNexis, given to a library and so forth. So it might be as part of my deal, just in the to publish this thing in the Journal of American Medicine or something. It may be that I have to sign the rights to my copyrighted study as part of my publishing deal. It's not typical with things like books and comics to assign the rights. What is typical is that they get an exclusive publishing arrangement with you. So that's probably what's really being alleged. But again, without looking at the contracts, I can't know for certain. All right. And he says, so you can allow the concepts to be used post-domain, but the stories can't be connected to any new stories outside of DC publishing. I think the actual thing that can't be done, or that Bill certainly can't do, is he can't publish his own stuff, because he's still bound. Even if I do it with public domain characters, like let's say that I, Pete Bickford, decide I'm going to write a whole new series based on Sherlock Holmes, right? Sherlock Holmes, a public domain character, and Watson, both public domain, formerly created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Copyright on that thing expired 1 million years ago, which is why they keep on coming up in fiction, right? Because no one can trademark those characters. If I change the character enough, so if I make it really, really distinctive, possible I can trademark that character. So for instance, can I trademark young Sherlock Holmes? That's Spielberg, I believe, did that, and I'd say he's probably got a good shot at that one. Of saying young Sherlock Holmes, as seen in the movie of the same name, is trademark of him. You can't write another young Sherlock Holmes one that's substantially like that character without going through him. One thing that limits that is you have to prove that there isn't a it's not called inevitability, but it's you have to prove that there are multiple ways this thing could have been used, and that the way it was used was unique. So if basically if young Sherlock Holmes is just a younger version of Sherlock Holmes, the exact Arthur Conan Doyle character that we all know. I mean, he's shorter, he has less wrinkles, he still wears a deerstalker, whatever the thing was where he has getting around to wear a deerstalker. If that's all you do is run him younger, well, then that's probably inevitable, right? So you need to say there's something I did about my particular version of the character that wasn't inevitable, and so the only way he could have been was the way that came out. So because if it was inevitable, then it can't be trademarked. So maybe young Sherlock Holmes, maybe that one is a harder fight than I thought, because as far as I recall, they didn't do all that much to make them distinct. But let's say let's say what Bill Willingham did with Bigby Wolf, right? Which I assume is short for the Big Bad Wolf, where he made him a human lycanthrope, and this whole story essentially turns him into Sam Spade, right? That was not inevitable for the use of the Big Bad Wolf in the storyline. So I would assume that trademark is completely enforceable, except that he just gave it away. Now, if, as we're assuming, he's in an exclusive publishing arrangement with DC, then what Bill did is really, really, really interesting, because what it means is he still can't publish the works themselves. DC can now publish it any way they want, but then so can anyone else. And he's hoping that because because he's locked up, he's tied up by his own enforce agreements. He can't shape his own destiny on this one any further than he's already done. He's basically saying, look, I'm just throwing open the doors to this whole thing. Let everyone have at it, and not just those bastards at DC who clearly feel that they can go at it anyway. Now, where might Bill have come to that conclusion? And I think it really comes down to the Telltale Games incident. As he describes it, you saw that it started out with them not asking him for cover approval. And again, these are all his allegations. DC has not confirmed, but yeah, to me, he seems credible on these points. Certainly would welcome any response from DC on any of these issues, anything that I got wrong. I certainly would welcome any response from Bill. But it seems like where the situation really broke for him was the Telltale Games deal. Telltale Games, if you guys haven't seen it yet, did a monster great edition of Walking Dead. They were like the hot games company back in the early 2010s, and basically with a lot of story-based decision branching games. They did one for Batman. The Walking Dead one was absolutely terrific. I have not played the Fables, A Wolf Among Us one, although I hear good things about it. Unfortunately, by 2017, 2018, somewhere around there, the company ran out of money. They overextended themselves. I had a friend who, hi Charlene, who was working there at the time, and apparently it was just, when it went down, it went hard, and it was no fun at all. The company later got reacquired, brought back up on its feet, and some of the properties that were in production at the time where all went down, they are back and being developed, and one of those is the second season of Fables: A Wolf Among Us. But apparently, again, according to Bill Willingham, the original publishing deal he had didn't comment on the use of his stories and his characters for use in graphic, animated, game fiction, whatever you would want to call what it is that they did as far as video games. It didn't come up. Apparently, it certainly wasn't covered, at least as Bill's concerned. Now, this can go, if you guys have seen corporate contracts, a number of different ways. It can go, in the worst case, you say DC or mega company X acquires the use of your property for use in. You name a whole bunch of things, and all media not yet discovered or invented or whatever else. I mean, the language to that effect. That has actually happened. So when there are artists that had their works that were on album, and then cassettes came along, or then CDs came along, or then whatever else, VHS, these things would get used again and again and again. And some of these people with these older record deals, you say, wait a minute, I licensed this thing for a 45 and a long player, and suddenly this thing is coming back 30 years later on a CD reissue, and I don't get a dime. Because that wasn't part of I only had I only had royalty agreements for singles, and LPs. I didn't have agreements for CDs, and so you can publish all the CDs you want. You wouldn't have to pay me. Over time, once that happened to a few people, then people got smarter about a company, acquiring these things. But the world always goes in weird and unexpected ways. I mean, if there's a VR version of your property, what do the rights situations look like for that? Who knows? And it's hard to make a really hard point arguing about things like, well, here's a technology that may not ever exist, but if it does exist, I get X% of the pie. No, if companies can certainly get away with it, they will either say, look, we're going to publish you for this, that, and all the other ways that you might publish it, right? They'll do something like that. At which point, DC was probably making the claim that, hey, we already paid you for it, man. It's like, we don't need to pay you for the video game. But probably it was written in such a way, I say this based on the fact that they apparently were willing to give in the money, probably was written in such a way that a decent lawyer could make the case like, no, dude, this is a new publishing thing. It involved you have no rights to make this deal with Telltale in the first place. You need to come back to me and ask for the rights. You went ahead without me. You're now in breach. Now you're in a bunch of trouble. DC, I think, looked at this thing. It was ambiguous enough, or at least, their lawyers are acting this way, that they said, how about we instead give you money? So you get the money that you think you wanted, but we still don't admit that we exceeded the deal. That is at least what Bill Willingham's contention seems to be from what he's saying. If so, that would track with what meager facts I know about the situation. But look what happened from Bill's point of view as that happened. So wait a minute, you ran away, made a big deal to publish my stuff. They then hired new writers to adapt this any way they want, to change the characters in ways that I don't want. And then you took what they did and adapted it back into comic book form. Don't know if he got paid for that one or not, but he certainly didn't have control of the story by then. So work that he didn't do is now back on his home turn. It has been changed in ways that he doesn't, maybe even recognize anymore. Certainly isn't, he, didn't want. And now they're looking at doing a round 2. And according to Bill, he went and said, hey, what the heck? And DC's response, according to Bill, at least, was, well, it's our publishing deal. We can do what we want with it, and we don't need to ask you. And you could see how Bill, from Bill's point of view, that this would be an intolerable situation. If so, yeah, maybe given this very weird set of circumstances, maybe blowing the whole thing up, or at least blowing the whole thing open, denying, if he can't control because he's hamstrung by his own contracts with just personally with DC, throwing it open to the world. Maybe that was the most crazily genius thing that you could ever do in this situation. I don't know. I'm interested in your comments on this one, which I'm going to actually read some of right now because I've been talking for a really long time. It's a bear alert. No, I guess I've stunned you all into silence on this one, but there's a lot of people watching, so that's cool. But yeah, if you guys have comments on the whole thing, please let me know what you think of this whole thing. I think it's darned interesting. I will share a little bit of my perspective as a creator, getting involved with some of these publishing type deals, because I've been on both sides of the table a couple of times, and I am going to say what Bill says about the way that companies deal with creators is absolutely spot on. So when I was first doing ComicBase, I'm not sure if the focus is right here, so I'm going to just do. Yeah, it's really good to try to check focus without your glasses on and then adjust it. There we go. That's better. Okay. Yeah, it's like, wow, yeah, it looks a little blurry. It's like, well, there you go. Okay. So So when I was first doing ComicBase, we have filing cabinets full of permissions agreements from basically anyone we thought that might ever sue us. I mean, we were using covers, ComicBase covers, but you didn't want to take the chance of essentially having to allege fair use to cover them journalistically as part of a comic book thing, because this little mom and pop company, we could not afford to be sued by anyone. So we spent, I think our record, it was, I think DC Comics actually was 3 years getting a permission agreement with them, calling them about every Wednesday, Valerie Atlas and all those guys saying, hey, it's us again, those guys who want to do the multimedia database for comic books. Yeah, how's it looking for that permission agreement? But yeah, and in the end, we went around and we secured permission agreements from anyone we thought might, have a problem with our using their covers, and went from there. And the world has changed since then. I think it's really, really lightened up. I mean, once CDs came and went and people saw that you didn't immediately become a jillionaire making CD-based stuff, I don't think the level of fanaticism in companies' legal departments around the use of their trademarks is what it once was. But yeah, God knows we sweated this stuff, especially back when we were getting started. One of the people that we spent, I remember going around to a little comic show when you very first got going, a guy named Everett Hartso from Boneyard Press, and I'm like 22 or something at the time. I'm just a kid, and there's this scary motorcycle, looking guy. I mean, he looks like he could rip me in half when he was in a good mood. And I'm, kind of put my little permissions agreement up to him, saying, could we like to, show your covers or your things in our database, and he looks at me, and he's got this even scarier guy sitting next to him who's like completely bald, muscles out to here, as his co-publisher, who's probably a complete sweetheart and, loves his dog and his kids. But at the time, I was terrified of this guy. He looks at him, just, stares at me right in the eye. He says, look, let me tell you one thing, man. Doesn't matter what you put down on that bleeping piece of paper. It's like, are you gonna me or what? And it's like, no, sir, I just wanted to show your pictures and we'll have the copyright and all that stuff. It's like, well, okay then, because what matters on paper just doesn't matter, because all, again, I'm just imagining I'm beeping words right now. It's like it's all about like, are you, is your word any good? It's like, yes. It's like, and that's kind of where it all landed. And funny is, I was getting started there, and I've done a lot of deals since then with lawyers and stuff and the whole 9 yards. We had a publishing agreement with Comics Buyer's Guide, which we had to work out with the entire, corporate faculty of Krause Publications at the time. And at the end of the day, Everett Hartso, dude, if you ever listening to this one, you gave me some of the best legal advice of all time, because in any agreement you ever do, you're spot on, man. If the two sides want it to work, you're going to find a way to paper over all the rough edges. It's like a sense of humor is like the salve for all of life's rough edges. If you've got a sense of humor, or if you've got, the willingness to make the partnership work, then anything that's like a little bit bumpy, you'll be like, okay, how do we make this go? And you'll get over it, right? I mean, when we had an agreement with Comics Buyer's Guide, we kind of broke it down. It's like, okay, we will provide you with this much stuff every week in terms of content for your newspaper. When it comes time to price all the books once a year, you will do 2/3. We will do 1/3, because we've been doing all this other content for you all year round. You get to use this in print. We get to use it in comics and so forth, right? Now, we're also talking about, so when it comes time for like, all right, so we're beating up the spreadsheets. Are we counting every single line of what of what other work to be done to say what's 1/3 and what's 2/3? If someone's really busy, do they take a little bit more, less or a little bit more? Do we work out the rough edges? You're damn right we do, because we wanted the whole thing to go. If I had to be late with an article one month, did they say, you're in breach, you're in void? No, they wouldn't do that, because again, I'd done them solids on some other things. But so I mean, the whole thing worked out really well. I gotta say though, and the publisher I dealt with over at Comics Buyer's Guide was a stand-up guy. I wouldn't have done the deal if he wasn't. But I remember going into a subsequent deal, another thing with Krause Publications, which honestly I think they were willing to do, but they just kind of muffed it. I mean, it wasn't any of the guys I worked with. It was just some guys in some other departments just had the opportunity and just fumbled the ball. But yeah, I mean, there was definitely, I remember at one point have the publisher of Comics Buyer's Guide taking me aside and say, hey man, the other guys in my company, I got to tell you, they're saying, "Hey, what would it take for us to just take you out, essentially, to publish our own stuff without you, and use your stuff for our things and not have to work with you anymore." And he says, "Look, I'm not going to do that because, you know, we need you and we also made a deal. And so we both believe in the enterprise." But yeah, are there people in any large corporation who will look for, no matter how nice the corporation is per se, are there some people would be like, well, do I actually need this guy? Can I take him out, without paying him? Yeah, there's always going to be those guys. And if they're jerks enough and if they're in a high enough position, yeah, I mean, the deal you signed is only as good as the intentions behind it. I mean, if your lawyers are fantastic, they can hold off the end for a while, but the relationship will come to misery and it will come to a great deal of expense. You can't, it's like writing a contract with the devil. It's like, if you can't lawyer the thing enough to, I mean, you can keep them from specifically doing this, that, and the other thing to you, or that they will have to perform this, that, and the other thing. But there's always things that they will discover in the spaces that are absolutely intolerable to one side or another, which could never have been anticipated at the time of the contract. That, again, if there was goodwill on both sides, you'd paper over. But if there isn't, are going to become the schisms that just rip the deal apart. And I think something like that probably happened to Bill. So if I'm right about that, then my sympathies to Bill entirely. Yeah, I think it's a bold move, man. And it's it might be the smart move. I don't know, man, but it's one I think the whole comic industry really ought to be paying attention to. And by the way, just as point of perspective on this one, I don't know, when you're in these kind of death struggles with a company, it becomes very hard to enforce your will on them, or for that matter, even to enforce a penalty on them in the way you would imagine. Famously, Alan Moore, um, Alan Moore, Frank Miller, and such had a problem with DC was proposing a new rating system for comic books. It was going to essentially label a lot of the stuff that they saw as, look, we're writing stuff for adults, but it's not adult comics, right? We don't want the stuff to be labeled as, like, mature readers only, because we don't want it to seem like it's X-rated. So they banded together and said, look, if you don't back down on this one, we're not going to do your stuff anymore. And they sent a delegation out to England, and they tried to smooth over the waters with Alan Moore. But bit by bit, he just came to feel like he was being disrespected by DC. He said, look, I turned to this terrific work for you guys on Swamp Thing, this terrific work on Watchmen. I mean, you guys are, you got rights to the novel and the thing, but you're driving me crazy now. I don't believe your interests are my interests anymore. The people he dealt with originally were not the people that were being sent out to sweet talk him anymore. And eventually he just said, to hell with you guys. Take my name off of all of it. I don't want to be associated with you in whatever way. And DC's like, well, we still get the publishing rights to Watchmen, right? We can publish that thing as many times as we want. I said, yeah, I know, but screw you. He couldn't stop them. And he still gets a royalty check every single time they sell a copy of Watchmen. But his current position on this one, and I'll bet he's a little fanatical on this one. I think he'd back me on this. He said, at this point, yeah, send my royalty checks to Black Lives Matter, for God's sake. I don't even care. But I don't, you guys are scum. I don't want to deal with you. And DC's probably okay with all things considered, because Watchmen continues to be about the only superhero graphic novel that continually is in the top sellers year after year after year. And they also, over time, figured out that they can write brand new Watchmen's, series using characters which, were created by Alan Moore out of his mind, which they control the rights to, and everything else. And they can keep the property running without him. And they learned that, they can survive. So my advice to any creators who are contemplating being involved in any kind of publishing deal like this basically comes down to, if you think that you're dealing with a mass of snakes and potential betrayers, that just means you're paying attention. The particular people across the table, if you think those guys are snakes and betrayers, just walk. None of it's worth it. But is there someone else in the organization that will come after them who is a snake? Count on it. It's corporations and companies exist to make money. People by and large exist to, we have other purposes than that. And one of the big things that keeps people acting decently is a sense of morals, a sense of integrity, and also a sense of just like, look, I gave you my word. I'm gonna keep my word because I promised you something. Corporations don't have that. And so it's like dealing with a robot which is there primarily to serve the robot's interests. It can like you, it can respect you, but it's never going to deal with you inherently. Integrity is not, it's not part of its makeup. It's not something a corporation has by its nature. It's something the people in it might have. But counting on a nonstop, procession of people in a corporation behaving with integrity, man, as time goes by, it's a longer and longer shot bet, and you never want to be in a deal with someone where you doubt the integrity. So always leave yourself a way out. One of the best ways, and honestly, you got to appreciate the genius of the United States Constitution in this one. You might say, the people who found the country were terrific men, great legends of history, epic people. One of the smartest things they ever did is realize that people of ambition are always going to be there. No one's an angel. And the best way you can keep people who have ambition from doing horrible things is just to pit the ambition against the ambition, to make it so that, my ambition is thwarted by your ambition. So when you look at the checks and balances of the United States government, it's not assuming that, oh, well, the Senate's always really smart. The Congress, they can get out of control, but the Senate's always really smart. So we'll just let the Senate run things. No, no, no. It says Congress is full of hard-driving, ambitious people who will do whatever they want to get their way. The Senate's full of ambitious, hard-driving people which will do what they want to get their own way, which, by the way, in the original conceit of this, was meant not so much as between two houses of the same group like it is right now, but prior to the 18th Amendment, the idea was that you were balancing the ambitions of the people as a whole, which is represented by Congress. That's the hoi polloi, you and me. The states, which the representative of the state was your senator. He didn't get elected popularly. He was appointed by the governor until the 18th Amendment. And so, the states had an interest, the people had an interest, and the government had an interest. And by pitting all those interests against each other, you could kind of keep the wheels on the bus. But you gotta appreciate the genius of that. But similarly, when you're having your own contracts, really, really helpful if the guy who would be out there to screw you would be taking his own life if he did it. So if, the reason I never got screwed ultimately on any of my deals with Comics Buyers Guide, yes, I was dealing with lovely people who acted with great integrity. Do I know there were people who weren't acting, who given a chance would have done bad things, with the deal and screwed me over? Yeah, I know those people existed. They never got to do anything because they needed me so badly to provide data and to provide what I did. They couldn't fill that gap. So you want to make something where if they screw you over, it will screw them over in turn. And then the easy thing to do is just, but we don't screw each other over. If you can ever set up a deal that way, that's really to your interest. And finally, never be replaceable if you can possibly avoid it. One problem that creators typically have, and I think artists have this worse than writers have this for the most part, is that I can always find an artist to draw a shiny, really pretty picture for me. And if the guy I like right now, if he's not working out, if he's thrown too much static my way, or I feel like he's trouble, I can hire a different artist, right? There's a lot of competition there, and there's someone else who's absolutely happy to fill in, take their place. If you're a really good writer, and here I'm thinking about, the Alan Moores, I'm thinking about the Neil Gaimans, things like that, the Frank Millers. You can't just swap another guy in for that guy and have people not notice. It might be that you can swap someone else in at a cost that, is worth paying. It's, certainly in the end that, DC got along without Alan Moore, but would they have been better off with him? Yeah, I think if we're talking about the 1980s Alan Moore, I think you're probably darn sure, So you want to try to not be replaceable in your deal. So because, again, assuming the guys on the other side will act according to their own incentives, and their incentive will always be, hey, how do I maximize my position, whether it hurts your feelings or not. You always want to make it so that is not a tenable situation for them. So anyway, guys, that's my generic advice for that whole thing, but we'll take it from there. Just to close up a little bit here, obviously a PSA time from the whole thing. Let's see here. Some LOLings. Oh yes. Please, folks, as you do this one, please smash the like button and hit the subscribe if you have not done it yet. Please, let's see here. It says like and subscribe. Don't forget, we have a dedicated thread on the ComicBase message boards, and where you can request live stream topics and demos. And finally, of course, Andre's world famous ComicBase cover catalog has been updated. The torrent link is up in the boards. All right, guys, I think that will do it. All right. God knows what we'll talk about this next time. If there's any kind of update on this one, I'd love to hear it. And if any of the parties involved come after me, either with comments or C&Ds, I'll let y'all know. All right, guys, you have a good one, and I will catch you on the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.